close your eyes if you have not already done so. Let your shoulders soften against whatever surface holds you now, and allow the weight of the day, all its brightness, all its noise, to begin its slow and gentle retreat. There is nothing pressing here. There is nothing that requires your attention in this moment. Only the soft, slow passage of time, and a story that has been waiting patiently for centuries to be told to someone lying exactly where you are lying now, breathing exactly as you are breathing, drifting toward that quiet threshold between wakefulness and rest. Let your body grow heavy. Let the room around you grow dim and far away. And let us drift back together, back through time, back through the long centuries, to a world that glittered and smelled of coal smoke and candlelight. A world in which a fine white powder sat quietly on kitchen shelves and apothecary counters, on the mantels of grand houses and the windowsills of modest cottages, unremarked upon, unquestioned, as ordinary and as lethal as the age that embraced it. If this voice helps you find your rest tonight, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby. But only if you are still awake to hear these words, which, by now, perhaps you are not. And if you have already drifted, then rest well, and we will still be here when you return. The story, after all, is not going anywhere. It has waited this long. It can wait a little longer still. The element we have come to call arsenic, a word that arrives in English through the old French arsenic and the Latin arsenicum, reaching back still further to the Greek arsenikon and the Persian zarnik, meaning simply golden, has existed in the earth itself since the planet cooled and settled into its ancient form. It is not a creation of human ingenuity, not a compound invented in some medieval alchemist's laboratory or fashioned in the smoky workshops of the Industrial Revolution, but rather a natural constituent of the rock and soil beneath our feet, a metalloid element, number 33 on the periodic table, grey and lustrous in its pure form, though rarely encountered that way by ordinary people throughout history. What ordinary people encountered instead was arsenic trioxide, the white, tasteless, odorless powder produced when arsenic-bearing ores are smelted, a powder so fine it could be dissolved invisibly in soup or stirred without detection into a glass of wine or a cup of morning tea. It was this form, arsenic trioxide, that would come to define an entire era of human history, that would sit at the center of courtroom dramas and domestic tragedies and parliamentary debates, that would lend itself to the pages of newspapers and the whispered conversations of neighbors who wondered, perhaps too quietly, whether the illness consuming the master of the house had a cause more deliberate than nature alone. The ancient Greeks knew arsenic compounds in the form of realgar and orpiment, the yellow and red sulfide minerals that glittered in the stone, and they used them as medicines and as pigments, applying them to skin conditions and ulcers in practices recorded by physicians who wrote their observations by the light of oil lamps in cities that have since crumbled into archaeological memory. Hippocrates himself described the therapeutic application of arsenic compounds as escharotics, substances capable of generating a kind of controlled tissue death when applied to certain cancers of the breast and skin, and his recommendations would echo through centuries of medical tradition, passed from teacher to student and from manuscript to manuscript across the long, slow accumulation of Western medical knowledge. Meanwhile, in the ancient pharmacopoeias of China, arsenic compounds appeared with equal regularity, included among the remedies of traditional Chinese medicine, for conditions ranging from parasitic infections to respiratory ailments. The preparation described in texts that were themselves the products of long traditions of observation and careful, if not always accurate, empirical reasoning, The Romans, too, were acquainted with arsenic and its dangers, and the historian Suetonius and others, who wrote of the poisonings that moved through the imperial households of Rome, the deadly cups, the suspicious fevers, the convenient deaths of inconvenient relatives, may well have been describing, without knowing it precisely, the symptoms that arsenic trioxide produced when administered in careful, repeated doses over many days or weeks. It is worth noting, in these early centuries, that arsenic existed in a peculiar double space in the human imagination. It was simultaneously a medicine and a weapon, a substance that healed and a substance that destroyed. And this ambiguity would persist, and indeed deepen, across the centuries that followed. Through the long centuries of the medieval period, arsenic moved quietly through the fabric of European society, present in the mines and the smelters, present in the workshops of the alchemists, who sought to transform base metals into gold, and found instead a catalogue of poisons and potions that would shape the chemistry of centuries to come. Alchemy, for all its mysticism and its aspirations toward the impossible, was also a serious tradition of chemical investigation, and the alchemists who worked with arsenic compounds, heating them, combining them with other substances, observing the colors and the smells and the transformations that resulted, were accumulating a body of practical knowledge that would eventually pass into medicine and into industry, carried forward by practitioners who did not always share the same vocabulary or the same theoretical framework, but who were unified by their encounter with the physical properties of the material world. The physician and alchemist known as Paracelsus, who lived from 1493 to 1541, is perhaps the most significant figure in the long history of arsenic as medicine, for it was Paracelsus who articulated the principle that would govern toxicology for centuries to come. The idea that the dose alone makes the poison, that every substance, no matter how dangerous, exists on a continuum between medicine and toxin, and that the difference between healing and harm lies not in the nature of the substance itself, but in the quantity administered. Paracelsus worked with arsenic compounds directly, incorporating them into his broader pharmacological practice, and arguing, in the dense and often impenetrable Latin of Renaissance medical writing, that controlled doses of arsenic could stimulate the vital forces of the body in ways that produced measurable therapeutic benefit. His ideas were controversial in his own time, and remained so after his death, but they established arsenic as a legitimate, if carefully managed, component of the physician's toolkit, a status it would retain in various forms and under various names well into the 19th century. Meanwhile, in the courts and palaces of Renaissance Italy, arsenic was acquiring a rather different reputation, one that had less to do with healing and rather more to do with the management of political inconvenience. The Borgia family, whose name has become almost synonymous with Renaissance poisoning in the popular imagination, are said by contemporaries and historians to have employed arsenic compounds among the tools of their considerable political arsenal, though the historical evidence is, as historians frequently caution, more suggestive than conclusive. Whether or not the Borgias poisoned precisely as many people as legend credits them with, the association between arsenic and political murder in Renaissance Italy reflects something true about the period. Arsenic trioxide was available, it was tasteless, and the symptoms it produced could be mistaken for the numerous fevers and intestinal illnesses that circulated in a world without germ theory, without diagnostic medicine, and without any reliable means of detecting the presence of arsenic in the body of the deceased. The great courts of Europe were, During this period, places of considerable political anxiety and the proximity of poison to power was a fact of life acknowledged, if rarely spoken aloud, in the correspondence and the diaries of those who moved within them. It was during the 18th century that arsenic began its transformation from a courtly poison and a chemical curiosity into something far more domestic, far more widely distributed, and far more deeply embedded in the everyday lives of ordinary people across Europe and particularly across Britain. The process by which this transformation occurred was not dramatic in the way that historical transformations are sometimes imagined to be. There was no single invention, no sudden decree, no moment of collective decision, but rather the gradual accumulation of industrial and commercial developments that made arsenic both vastly more abundant and vastly more accessible than it had ever been before. The expansion of copper and tin mining in Britain, particularly in the counties of Cornwall and Devon, produced arsenic trioxide as a natural byproduct of the smelting process, and the quantities generated were so enormous that the mining companies found themselves obliged, for purely practical reasons, to sell the excess at very low prices, rather than simply allow it to accumulate in the yards of their smelters. Arsenic trioxide was, as a consequence, cheaper than almost any other poison, cheaper by far than many foods, and it was sold without restriction in the shops and markets of every town and village across the British Isles, available to anyone who wished to purchase it for whatever purpose they cared to name. The stated purpose, in most cases, was the extermination of rats, which were a genuine and persistent problem in both rural and urban households of the period, consuming stored grain and spreading disease through their presence in the spaces where people lived and worked and kept their provisions. Rat poison was a legitimate and commonly understood reason for purchasing arsenic, and the shopkeepers who sold it did so without particular concern, weighing out the white powder in small paper packets that were then carried home and placed on shelves alongside the sugar and the flour in containers that were not always clearly marked. In households where the consequences of confusion were sometimes devastating. It was also during this period that arsenic began to acquire its role in medicine under a more systematized and scientifically presented form through the work of the English physician Thomas Fowler, who in 1786 introduced to medical practice a compound known thereafter as Fowler's solution, a preparation of potassium arsenite dissolved in water, flavored with lavender to make it more palatable, and prescribed for a remarkable range of conditions, including intermittent fevers, epilepsy, asthma, skin diseases, and what physicians of the time described, with characteristic vagueness, as general debility. Fowler's solution would remain in use well into the 20th century, prescribed by generations of physicians who understood, or believed they understood, the narrow margin between its therapeutic and its toxic effects, and who administered it to patients who trusted, as patients generally do, that the pale liquid in the brown glass bottle was helping rather than harming them. Thomas Fowler himself was a thoughtful and observant physician, a man who had spent years in general practice in Stafford before publishing in 1786 his careful and somewhat tentative medical report on the use of the arsenical solution that would bear his name, and who was genuinely attempting, within the limits of the medicine of his time, to document both the benefits and the dangers of the compound he had observed in clinical use. His solution had in fact been used prior to his documentation of it. A similar preparation had been circulating in Staffordshire and Cheshire as a favourable folk remedy under the name of Thomas Wilson's tasteless egg drop. But it was Fowler's publication that brought it into the mainstream of medical practice and gave it the institutional respectability that would ensure its longevity across more than a century of changing medical fashions. The conditions for which Fowler's solution was prescribed were, by the standards of the time, entirely plausible. Arsenic had demonstrated measurable effects on a number of physiological processes, including the stimulation of the skin and the suppression of certain fevers. And in an era before the germ theory of disease, before the development of specific pharmaceutical agents, for specific conditions, a compound that produced visible changes in the body's presentation was often assumed, reasonably if incorrectly, to be doing something beneficial. Physicians noted that patients taking Fowler's solution sometimes appeared to gain weight, to develop a rosier complexion, to report an increase in energy and vitality, effects that were attributed to the therapeutic action of the arsenic, but which we now understand to be consistent with the early stages of chronic arsenic toxicity, during which the body's physiological responses to low-level poisoning can produce some effects that superficially resemble improvement. Meanwhile, in the broader culture of the period, arsenic was acquiring a domestic ubiquity that extended far beyond its role as a rat poison or a medicine, entering the home through an entirely different route, through the walls themselves, through the very fabric of interior decoration, through the fashionable and brilliantly coloured wallpapers that were, by the middle decades of the 19th century, considered an essential marker of domestic refinement and good taste. The green pigments that Victorian manufacturers used to produce the most fashionable wallpaper colours were arsenical compounds, most notably the compound known as Scheele's green, invented in 1775 by the German-Swedish chemist Carl Wilhelm Scheele, and the more stable, more vivid compound, known variously as emerald green, Paris green, or Schweinfurt green, introduced in 1814 by the German industrialist Wilhelm Sattler. These pigments were strikingly beautiful, producing a depth and luminosity of colour that the organic dyes of the period could not match, and they were adopted with enthusiasm by manufacturers and consumers alike, adorning the walls of drawing rooms and nurseries and bedrooms across Britain and across Europe in shades of green that were, quite literally, composed in significant part of arsenic. The scale of arsenic's presence in Victorian domestic life was, in retrospect, almost breathtaking in its comprehensiveness, a fact that historians of the period have returned to again and again with a kind of quiet astonishment at the degree to which a substance so demonstrably dangerous could become so completely integrated into the ordinary fabric of daily existence, without, for many decades, provoking the sustained alarm that such integration would surely merit in any other context. James C. Warnton, in his 2010 study, The Arsenic Century, How Victorian Britain Was Poisoned at Home, Work and Play, documented with meticulous care the extraordinary range of consumer goods that contained arsenic compounds in significant quantities during the Victorian period. Not only the green wallpapers that have attracted the most historical attention, but also green fabrics and clothing, including the fashionable green evening dresses and the green ribbons that were worn by ladies at balls and assemblies, and that sometimes produced inflammatory skin conditions in those who wore them for extended periods. Arsenic was also present in children's toys, painted in the bright greens and yellows that were intended to attract and delight young minds, but that also deposited arsenic compounds onto small hands that were, in the natural way of small children, frequently brought to the mouth. It was present in candles and in confectionery, in beer and in wine, in the coloured papers used to wrap food for sale at market stalls, and in the artificial flowers and Christmas tree decorations that were among the most beloved ornamental features of the Victorian domestic interior, crafted in brilliant arsenical greens and displayed in heated rooms where they would gently, invisibly, release their toxic compounds into the air, breathed by the family gathered below. The workers who manufactured these products were, as historians have established through the medical records and mortality statistics of the period, exposed to levels of arsenic that produced chronic and debilitating illness, with the women employed in the factories of London and Birmingham, who spent their days cutting and shaping arsenical artificial flowers, developing the characteristic symptoms of arsenic poisoning, the skin sores, the respiratory difficulties, the peripheral neuropathy, in proportions that alarmed the medical observers who wrote about them in the medical journals of the 1860s and 1870s. William Matthew Williams wrote in 1861 of the flower makers of the artificial flower trade, describing the pallor and the afflictions of the young women who worked with arsenical pigments for long hours in poorly ventilated rooms, and his observations were part of a growing body of medical and public health literature that was, slowly and unevenly, beginning to turn the tide of public opinion against the casual domestic use of arsenic compounds. Yet even as awareness grew, and even as the first tentative legislative measures began to take shape in the early 1850s, arsenic remained available and remained present throughout the homes and bodies of the Victorian population, not as an exceptional substance, requiring exceptional caution, but as a mundane and familiar feature of a world that had, over many decades, simply grown accustomed to its presence. It is worth pausing, as we settle more deeply into the middle decades of the 19th century, to consider what it meant to be ill in a Victorian household, what it meant to feel the body declining, in ways that the medicine of the time could not reliably explain or arrest, and how very difficult it was, in that world of incomplete knowledge and imperfect diagnostic tools, to distinguish between illness that had arrived by natural means and illness that had been, with deliberate and quiet care, introduced from without. The Victorian household was, for many of those who lived within it, a place of genuine physical vulnerability, a place where fevers came and went with disturbing regularity, where children sickened and sometimes did not recover, where adults in what should have been the prime of their lives succumbed to conditions that their physicians described in broad and often unhelpful terms as gastric fever, inflammation of the stomach, or a general failure of the vital functions. Arsenic trioxide, administered in small repeated doses over a period of days or weeks, produced a clinical picture that bore a striking and deeply unfortunate resemblance to precisely these kinds of illnesses: the nausea, the abdominal discomfort, the increasing weakness and weight loss, the occasional vomiting, and the disturbance of the digestive system. All of these could be, and frequently were, attributed by attending physicians to natural causes, to the impure water supplies of Victorian towns, to the bad air that miasma theory still held responsible for so much illness, to the constitutional weakness that was thought in medical circles of the time to predispose certain individuals to gastric complaints. A physician attending a patient who was, in fact, being slowly poisoned with arsenic would, in the absence of any reason to suspect deliberate harm, treat the case with the remedies available to him: bismuth preparations for the stomach, tonics for the weakness, rest and light diet for the general decline. and would very often sign the death certificate when death finally came with a diagnosis that reflected his honest but tragically mistaken assessment of the natural causes he believed he had witnessed. It was this diagnostic invisibility that made arsenic such a peculiarly effective instrument of deliberate harm in an era before forensic toxicology had developed reliable methods of detection. And it was this same invisibility that allowed arsenic to claim, over the first several decades of the 19th century, a number of lives that historians and medical commentators have since estimated with appropriate caution but consistent concern. The nickname that arsenic trioxide acquired during this period, the inheritor's powder, or in French, poudre de succession, speaks with quiet eloquence to the understanding that was already present in popular consciousness, even before it was fully present in legal and medical practice. The understanding that a fine white powder, tasteless and odorless, dissolved in the soup or the tea of an inconvenient husband or a slow-to-die elderly relative was a means by which estates and inheritances and the release from unhappy marriages might be obtained with a discretion that the law, for the time being, was largely powerless to address. The phrase itself, poudre de succession, appears in French sources from at least the 17th century, suggesting that the practice of using arsenic for domestic murder was not an invention of the Victorian age, but a tradition with considerably longer roots. A tradition that the Victorian era simply inherited, along with everything else, from the long and sometimes troubling history that preceded it. Meanwhile, the trade in arsenic continued across Britain and France and the German states, and across the broader world of European commerce, without particular regulation, available in pharmacies and general stores and market stalls, weighed out in small quantities for the dozens of legitimate purposes for which it was genuinely used, and occasionally purchased for purposes rather less legitimate, by individuals whose names would eventually, in some cases, become part of the historical record in ways they had neither anticipated nor desired. The social historian of the period reads these transactions. The small paper packets, the casual purchasers, the shopkeepers who remembered faces and quantities in the aftermath of inquests, as evidence of a world in which the boundary between the domestic and the deadly was, for certain substances at certain moments in history, almost imperceptibly thin, a membrane so fine that it required an entirely new science to begin to make it visible. And it was precisely the development, that new science, the science of forensic toxicology, that would, over the course of the 1830s and 1840s, begin to transform the legal and medical landscape around arsenic poisoning in ways that were both practically significant and deeply culturally resonant, creating the conditions under which the inheritor's powder would gradually become, if not impossible to use with impunity, then considerably less reliable as a means of escaping the attention of the law. The story of that transformation is, in its own quiet way, one of the most significant chapters in the history of medicine, and it begins with a chemist working in a laboratory in London in the year 1836, a man named James Marsh, whose name would eventually become attached to a test so elegant and so reliable that it would change forever the evidentiary landscape of arsenic murder trials in courts across Europe and beyond. James Marsh was born in 1794 and worked for much of his career as a chemical assistant at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, a position that placed him at the intersection of practical chemistry and institutional science, where the demands of demonstration and instruction had cultivated in him a careful, methodical approach to chemical investigation that would prove, in the circumstances of 1836 to be exactly what was needed. The case that prompted his invention was not, in itself, particularly remarkable by the standards of the arsenic poisoning trials that were already beginning to accumulate in the court records of the period. A man named John Bodle had been accused of poisoning his grandfather, George Bodle, with arsenic administered through the morning coffee, and the evidence against him rested in part on chemical tests conducted on samples of the coffee and the stomach contents of the deceased, that the available methods of detection had been unable to render conclusive in the legal sense required for conviction. Marsh, having conducted his own analysis of the samples, and having found arsenic present by the methods then available, was frustrated by the courtroom outcome. Bodle was acquitted, and reportedly later confessed to the crime, though the legal moment had passed, and turned his considerable intelligence to the problem of developing a test that would produce visible, unambiguous, reproducible evidence of arsenic's presence in the kind of form that a jury of non-scientists could understand, and a defense counsel could not easily undermine. The test he developed over the following months was, in its fundamental principle, elegant and simple. When a sample suspected of containing arsenic was introduced into a closed apparatus with zinc and sulfuric acid, the chemical reactions produced hydrogen gas, and any arsenic present in the sample would combine with that hydrogen to form arsine gas, which, when passed through a heated glass tube, would decompose and deposit a distinctive metallic mirror-like stain of pure arsenic on the inner surface of the tube, a stain that was visible to the naked eye, that could be preserved and presented in court as physical evidence, and that could not be produced by any other commonly encountered substance. Marsh published his test in the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal in 1836, and it was rapidly taken up by chemists and physicians across Britain and Europe, who recognized immediately that they now possessed something that had not previously existed. A reliable, reproducible, legally defensible means of establishing the presence of arsenic in biological tissues, in food, in drink, in the stomach contents and organs of the deceased. The test arrived at a moment when it was, in the most direct sense, needed, when the courts of Britain and France and the German-speaking world were wrestling with a rising tide of arsenic poisoning cases, and with the inadequacy of the forensic tools available to prosecute them. And it transformed, over the course of the late 1830s and the 1840s, the relationship between chemistry and the law in ways that its inventor could perhaps only partially have foreseen. Marsh himself did not live to see the full flowering of his invention's influence. He died in 1846, at the age of 51, having seen the test named for him become the standard of forensic arsenic detection across Europe, having watched it applied in cases that filled the newspapers and the public imagination, having contributed, through his patient and methodical work in a laboratory at Woolwich, to a revolution in forensic science whose consequences extended far beyond the particular compound he had set out to detect. His death was reported in the chemical and medical journals of the period with the brief, respectful notice appropriate to a man of science who had made a genuine contribution to his field, and he was buried without the kind of public ceremony that attended the deaths of more celebrated figures, as so many of the genuinely significant contributors to this history of medicine and science have been, their influence persisting long after their names have faded from the general memory. The Marsh test continued to be refined and improved by subsequent workers. John Jacob Berzelius had made earlier contributions to arsenic detection methodology, and the Spanish-born French chemist Mathieu Orfila, would go on to make further critical refinements that addressed some of the test's initial limitations, and it was Orfila who would carry the Marsh test into the courtroom drama that would make the detection of arsenic poisoning genuinely famous across the civilized world of the mid-19th century. That courtroom drama took place in France in the year 1840 in a provincial town called Tulle in the Corrèze department, and at its center was a young woman named Marie Fortuné Capel, who had become, through an arranged marriage she had not particularly welcomed, Madame Marie Lafarge, and who would become, through the events that followed, one of the most debated and most written about women of her century. Marie Fortuné Capel was born in Paris in 1816, the daughter of a colonel who had served in Napoleon's artillery, and a mother who died when Marie was young, leaving her to be raised in a social world that valued refinement, education, and the careful management of appearances above almost everything else. She was educated at the convent school of Saint Denis, an institution that had also educated members of the imperial family, and that produced in its graduates a particular combination of intellectual ambition and social grace. And she grew into a young woman of considerable intelligence, wide reading, and an artistic sensibility that expressed itself in watercolors and in the long, introspective letters she wrote throughout her life, with a fluency and a self-awareness that would later make those letters some of the most scrutinized documents in the history of 19th century French law. The marriage to Charles Pouch Lafarge in 1839 was arranged through the offices of a matrimonial agency, an institution that was, in the Paris of the July monarchy, entirely respectable and widely used by families seeking to place daughters of good background but modest fortune. And it paired Marie with a man who was, by most contemporary accounts, a coarse and not particularly appealing ironmaster from the rural Corrèze, a man whose provincial manners and modest establishment at the family property, known as Le Glandier, represented a considerable diminishment from the Parisian social world in which Marie had been raised, and to which she had understood herself to belong. Le Glandier was, as Marie described it in her memoirs and her letters, with a quiet and persistent unhappiness, a damp and gloomy property, far from the society and the intellectual stimulation she had known in Paris, surrounded by the wooded hills of the Corrèze, in a landscape that was beautiful in ways she acknowledged, but that she found oppressive in its isolation, its distance from everything she had known and valued. Charles Lafarge was not a cruel man, by most accounts, but he was not the husband Marie had hoped for, and the discrepancy between what she had imagined and what she had received shaped the emotional atmosphere of the marriage from its earliest days, colouring the domestic arrangements at Le Glandier with a melancholy that Marie recorded with unusual candour in the correspondence she maintained with the friends she had left behind in Paris. Charles Lafarge travelled to Paris in December 1839, some months after their marriage, on business connected with the ironworks he was attempting to establish. And during his absence, Marie sent him, according to the account that would later be presented at trial, a package of cakes she had prepared, after the consumption of which Charles reported feeling unwell, though he recovered on this occasion, and returned to Le Glandier. In January 1840, Charles Lafarge fell seriously ill, with the nausea and the weakness and the progressive deterioration that his attending physicians, there were several, consulted in sequence as his condition failed to improve, attributed at first to natural causes, to a gastric illness of the kind that was not uncommon in the rural France of the period, in households where the water supply was uncertain and the food preservation was imperfect. Marie nursed him during this illness, with what her defenders would later describe as devoted attention, and with what her accusers would describe as the careful management of a poisoner who had not yet achieved her object, and the two interpretations, so utterly irreconcilable, so dependent on assumptions about character and motive that neither side could prove, would divide France throughout the trial and for many years afterward. Charles Lafarge died on the 14th of January 1840, and within days of his death, the suspicions that had been circulating among the members of his family, who had observed Marie adding white powder to his drinks and food during his illness, had hardened into an accusation that would place Marie Lafarge before the assizes of Toul in September of that year, in a trial that would become the most watched and most debated legal proceeding of its era, and that would introduce to a broad public audience, for the first time, the extraordinary implications of the Marsh test and the emerging science of forensic toxicology. The provincial setting of the trial, the youth and the evident refinement of the accused, the gap between her social presentation and the nature of the charge against her, the passionate public debate about her guilt or innocence that divided French society along lines that intersected with questions of class and gender and the nature of marriage. All of these elements combined to make the Lafarge case something more than a criminal trial, to make it a cultural event, a national conversation conducted in newspapers and pamphlets, and drawing rooms and cafes about subjects that went considerably deeper than the question of whether a particular woman had administered arsenic to a particular man in a particular house in the Carrés. Mathieu Orfila, who would play the decisive role in the scientific evidence at the Lafarge trial, was himself one of the most significant figures in the history of forensic medicine, a man whose contributions to the systematic study of poisons and their effects on the human body had already, by 1840, established him as the foremost toxicologist in France, and one of the most respected in the world. Born in 1787 in Mahon, on the island of Minorca, then a Spanish possession, Orfila had studied medicine in Valencia and Barcelona before traveling to Paris, where he enrolled at the School of Medicine and distinguished himself with a combination of intellectual brilliance and methodical industriousness that brought him rapidly to the attention of the leading figures of French medical science. His great work, the Traité des Poisons, or Treatise on Poisons, was first published in 1813, when Orfila was only 26 years old, and it represented a systematic and comprehensive survey of the toxic properties of a broad range of substances, minerals, vegetables, and animal products, organized according to their physiological effects and their methods of detection, a work so thorough and so clearly written that it established the field of toxicology as a distinct medical discipline and earned its author a reputation that spread rapidly across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic. The traité went through multiple editions and was translated into several languages, and it was consulted by physicians and chemists and legal authorities across the Western world as the standard reference work on poison and its effects for several decades, a position it maintained even as new discoveries, including the Marsh test, whose significance Orfila recognized immediately, required revisions and expansions to keep pace with the advancing state of knowledge. When the Lafarge trial began in September 1840, the initial chemical analyses conducted by local pharmacists and physicians had produced contradictory results, with some analysts reporting the presence of arsenic in the stomach contents and the food samples, and others using the same materials, reporting that they could not confirm its presence, a situation that reflected the genuine limitations of the pre-Marsh detection methods rather than any dishonesty on the part of those conducting the analysis. The defense team for Marie Lafarge initially appeared to be in a strong position, able to point to this contradictory evidence as sufficient grounds for reasonable doubt. And the proceedings seemed, for a time, to be heading toward an acquittal that would have left the question of Charles Lafarge's death unresolved by the standards of the new forensic science. The court then took the unusual step of requesting that Orfila himself travel from Paris to Toul to conduct his own analysis of the available samples using the refined version of the Marsh test that he had developed and validated in his laboratory. And it was this request that transformed the trial from a provincial case into a national event, as the arrival of the most famous toxicologist in France to testify in a murder trial in a small town in the Corrèze drew the attention of every major newspaper in the country. Orfila arrived in Toul, conducted his analysis with the meticulous care for which he was known, and presented his findings to the court with the measured precision of a man who understood both the scientific and the legal weight of what he was, saying, "Arsenic was present in the exhumed body of Charles Lafarge," he testified, "in quantities that could not be attributed to natural environmental sources and that were consistent with deliberate administration." The defense challenged his methods and his conclusions with considerable vigor, bringing their own expert witnesses who questioned aspects of Orfila's procedure, but the court ultimately accepted Orfila's testimony as the most authoritative and the most methodologically rigorous account of the evidence available, and Marie Lafarge was convicted of the murder of her husband and sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor, a sentence later commuted to simple imprisonment. She died in 1852 at Ussat in the Ariège, where she had been released on grounds of ill health, maintaining her innocence to the end, and writing her memoirs in a prose that was, by all accounts, lucid and affecting, the work of a woman of genuine intelligence and genuine literary sensibility who had lived, whatever the truth of the case against her, one of the most extraordinary lives of her remarkable century. The Lafarge case did not, by itself, bring about the legislative and institutional changes that would eventually transform the regulation of arsenic in Britain and France, but it did something equally significant. It demonstrated, before an enormous public audience, that forensic chemistry had become capable of detecting arsenic in the human body with a reliability that made the old anonymity of the inheritors powder considerably less certain, and it introduced to popular consciousness the idea that the law and science were, together, beginning to close the gap that had for so long allowed arsenic to circulate through domestic life without adequate accountability. In Britain, the legislative response to the problem of arsenic poisoning was slower in arriving than some of its advocates had hoped, shaped as it was by the competing pressures of commercial interest, individual liberty, and the genuine practical difficulties of regulating a substance that had so many legitimate uses and was so deeply embedded in both domestic and industrial life. The years between the late 1830s and the passage of the Arsenic Act in 1851 were years of public debate, newspaper campaigning, and parliamentary manoeuvring in which the growing evidence of arsenic's role in both deliberate and accidental deaths was weighed against the arguments of those who believed that restriction of access to a useful substance was an unwarranted intrusion upon the freedom of the individual, consumer, and the legitimate interests of trade. The cases that drove the public debate were numerous and various, encompassing both the high-profile murder trials that attracted national attention and the quieter but no less devastating instances of accidental poisoning in which children had consumed arsenic-contaminated sweets, or in which entire families had been made ill by the arsenic leaching from the wallpaper in their bedrooms, or the green fabric of their curtains and their clothing. The medical literature of the period accumulated reports of these cases with a thoroughness that now allows historians to trace, in some detail, the geography and the social distribution of arsenic-related illness across the Victorian landscape, a geography that reveals the particular vulnerability of the poor and the working class, whose housing was more likely to incorporate cheap arsenical wallpapers, whose food was more likely to be wrapped in arsenical papers at market, and whose access to reliable medical advice was more limited. All of which conspired to make the toll of arsenic's domestic ubiquity fall most heavily on those least able to advocate for their own protection. The parliamentary debates over the Arsenic Act of 1851 are preserved in Hansard with a completeness that allows us to hear, across the distance of nearly 2 centuries, the voices of those who argued for restriction and those who argued against it, and to observe the gradual, uneven process by which the balance of political will shifted toward regulation over the course of the 1840s and the early 1850s, the act that was finally passed in August 1851, formally titled the Arsenic Act, or more precisely, an act to regulate the sale of arsenic, required that arsenic be sold only in the presence of a witness, that the purchaser's name and address be recorded in a register maintained by the seller, and that the arsenic be mixed with either soot or indigo to render it visibly distinguishable from the white powders, with which it might otherwise be confused, whether accidentally or deliberately. These were meaningful measures, and historians of public health have credited the act with a genuine reduction in both accidental arsenic poisoning and in the rate of arsenic murder in the decades following its passage, as the requirement for a witnessed purchase with a recorded name introduced a degree of accountability into transactions that had previously been entirely anonymous and therefore entirely untraced. The Act did not, however, address the arsenic in wallpaper, in clothing, in consumer goods of all descriptions, in the medicines still being prescribed by respectable physicians, or in the numerous other routes through which the Victorian population continued to encounter arsenic compounds in their daily lives. And this incompleteness was noted at the time by medical observers who understood that the sale of arsenic as a poison was only one dimension of a much larger problem. It is worth noting that the register of arsenic sales that the Act created became, in the years following its passage, one of the most important tools available to investigators of suspected poisoning cases, providing a paper trail that allowed the movement of arsenic from seller to purchaser to be reconstructed with a specificity that had not previously been possible, and that would prove, in a number of subsequent prosecutions, to be the decisive evidence on which convictions rested. The Act of 1851 was, in the judgment of most historians of the period, a reasonable first response to a genuine public health and public safety problem, imperfect in its scope and limited in its ambition, but real in its effects, a modest but meaningful step in the long and slow process by which Victorian society began, piece by piece, to come to terms with the extraordinary degree to which it had allowed a lethal substance to become an ordinary part of daily life. The decades following the passage of the Arsenic Act of 1851 were not, despite the new restrictions on its sale, a period in which arsenic disappeared from the domestic landscape of Victorian Britain or from the courts of law, where its effects continued to be examined and debated with a public fascination that showed no sign of diminishing. The murder trials that had defined the earlier decades of the century. The cases in which wives had poisoned husbands, or in which servants had poisoned employers, or in which the ambitious had poisoned those who stood between them and the inheritances they desired, continued to occur, if somewhat less frequently, as the Arsenic Act introduced new barriers while failing to eliminate entirely the determined and the desperate from the means they sought. The public appetite for these cases was, if anything, greater after 1851 than before, fed by an expanding popular press that had discovered in arsenic poisoning trials a combination of domestic drama, scientific testimony, and moral complexity that proved irresistible to the reading public, and that reported the proceedings with a thoroughness and a vividness of detail that made each major trial a national conversation, and each convicted prisoner a figure known across the country. Among the cases that attracted particular attention in the years following the Act was that of Mary Ann Cotton, a woman from County Durham, who was convicted in 1873 of the murder of her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, and who was subsequently strongly suspected, though prosecuted for only one death, of having been responsible for the deaths of as many as 21 people over a period of approximately 20 years, including several of her own children, multiple husbands, and various other relatives and lodgers, whose lives were insured and who died in ways that, examined in retrospect, presented a pattern of arsenic poisoning almost impossible to explain by natural causes alone. Mary Ann Cotton was a nurse by training, a woman who had moved through the industrial districts of County Durham and Yorkshire throughout the 1850s and 1860s, marrying and outliving a series of husbands whose life insurance policies provided her with modest sums that she used to support herself and her children, or at least those of her children who survived, which, over the long arc of her adult life, was a concerning proportion of those she had borne or taken into her care. The symptoms of her victims' illnesses were consistent across cases: the gastric distress, the weakness, the progressive deterioration, and they were attributed, by the physicians who attended them, to the gastric fever or the stomach illness that circulated in the poorly ventilated working-class housing of the Durham coalfields, with sufficient regularity that no individual case seemed, in isolation, particularly suspicious. It was only when a local doctor named Thomas Scattergood conducted a post-mortem examination of the body of Charles Edward Cotton in 1872 and detected arsenic in the stomach that the long chain of suspicious deaths associated with Mary Ann Cotton began to receive the scrutiny that its pattern perhaps warranted, and that the investigation that would eventually lead to her arrest and trial gathered its decisive momentum. Her trial at Durham Assizes in March 1873 attracted enormous public attention, and the evidence presented against her, the post-mortem findings, the insurance policies, the pattern of deaths, was compelling enough to secure her conviction, though the question of precisely how many deaths she was responsible for remained, and remains, a matter of historical debate rather than legal certainty. Mary Ann Cotton was hanged at Durham Prison on the 24th of March, 1873, and her case became one of the most discussed of the Victorian era, inspiring popular ballads and cautionary tales that circulated through the working-class culture of the north of England for decades afterward, a folk memory of the dangerous woman with the white powder who moved through households leaving grief and insurance claims in her wake. The sheer scale of the deaths attributed to her, if the historical suspicions are accurate, makes her case one of the most significant in the history of Victorian arsenic poisoning, and it raises questions about the systems of oversight, medical, legal, institutional, that allowed such a pattern to develop and persist over such a long period before it was recognized and acted upon. Questions that speak to the structural vulnerabilities of a society that was, despite its considerable achievements in science and industry, still catching up with the implications of the chemistry it had been living with for so long. The case of Mary Ann Cotton, seen alongside the legislative reforms of the 1850s and the forensic advances of the 1830s and 1840s, illustrates the uneven, non-linear nature of the progress that Victorian society made in confronting the arsenic problem. Progress that was real but halting, that advanced in some dimensions while remaining stationary or even retreating in others. And that would require many more decades of medical, legislative, and cultural change before arsenic would finally be reduced to a manageable and adequately regulated presence in the lives of ordinary people. It is worth turning our attention, as we move through the later decades of the Victorian era, toward the curious and deeply human phenomenon of arsenic eating, a practice that emerged from the mountain villages of Styria in what is now southern Austria, and that presented to the Victorian medical and scientific establishment a puzzle so genuinely perplexing that it occupied the minds of some of the most distinguished physicians of the age for many years, generating a literature of observation and debate that tells us as much about the assumptions and the blind spots of Victorian medicine as it does about the particular habits of the Styrian Highlanders themselves. The Styrian arsenic eaters, as they came to be known in the medical literature of the mid-19th century, were peasant farmers and labourers from the alpine districts around Graz and the surrounding mountain valleys who had developed, apparently over many generations, the practice of consuming arsenic trioxide as a tonic and a stimulant, beginning with small doses and gradually increasing the quantity they ingested over a period of months or years, in a manner strikingly analogous to the principle of graduated tolerance that modern pharmacology would later formalize. The practice was described in detail by the Austrian physician Johann Jakob von Tschudi, who published his observations in 1851 in a paper that circulated widely in European medical circles, and that introduced to a broader audience the remarkable claim that the Styrian peasants were consuming quantities of arsenic that would have been, in a person without their accumulated tolerance, rapidly and certainly fatal. Tschudi described men and women who swallowed pieces of arsenic trioxide the size of a pea, or larger, who reported increased vigor, improved complexion, and an enhanced capacity for physical labor at altitude, and who attributed to their arsenic habit a range of benefits that they described with the matter-of-fact confidence of people who had been raised within a tradition and had no reason to question its foundations. The medical significance of the Styrian arsenic eaters for the broader Victorian understanding of arsenic was considerable, because the existence of a population that consumed arsenic regularly and survived suggested, or seemed to suggest, that the boundary between toxic and therapeutic doses was more flexible than the simple model of arsenic as pure poison implied, and it provided ammunition to those physicians who continued to advocate for the therapeutic use of arsenic compounds in doses calibrated as Fowler and his successors had argued, to produce benefit rather than harm. The mechanism by which the Styrian arsenic eaters developed their tolerance was not, and could not be, understood within the physiological framework available to Victorian medicine, but we now understand it as reflecting a genuine cellular adaptation to repeated low-level arsenic exposure, involving upregulation of the metabolic pathways responsible for the methylation of inorganic arsenic into less toxic organic forms. A biological response that is real but that has limits, and that does not, as subsequent investigation has confirmed, protect against the cumulative long-term damage that chronic arsenic exposure produces in tissues throughout the body. The Styrian practice was also, as several commentators noted at the time, difficult to disentangle from the broader European tradition of using arsenic compounds as beauty aids, a tradition that was, by the middle decades of the 19th century, well established in the fashionable circles of Paris and London, where small quantities of arsenic were consumed by women who believed, with some observational basis, that the pale, luminous complexion that arsenic produced in the early stages of chronic exposure represented an improvement upon their natural appearance. The arsenic complexion, as it was understood in Victorian cosmetic culture, was a genuine physiological phenomenon produced by the effects of arsenic on blood vessel tone and on the deposition of melanin in the skin, effects that were real even if their cause was imperfectly understood. And the women who sought it were participating in a tradition of cosmetic risk. Taking that has parallels in every era of human history, from the lead-based face powders of the ancient world to the various preparations of the present day that are applied to the body in the hope of improving upon nature's arrangements. The arsenic wafers and arsenic complexion waters that were sold, sometimes openly and sometimes with a degree of discretion, in the cosmetic establishments of Victorian London and Paris, were products of a market that understood what its customers wanted and provided it, without excessive concern for the longer-term consequences. And the women who used them were, in most cases, entirely unaware that the pale glow they were cultivating was a symptom of low-level poisoning rather than a sign of improved health, a misunderstanding that speaks to the degree to which arsenic had been normalized, in all its forms, as simply a part of the material world that Victorians inhabited. The wallpaper question, which had been present in the background of Victorian public health discourse since at least the 1850s, came to particular prominence in the early 1880s through a set of investigations and publications that brought together the concerns of medical practitioners, public health advocates, and the growing consumer movement that was beginning, in this period, to articulate the idea that the individual purchaser had a right to expect that the goods available for sale in ordinary shops would not, when used as intended, cause them harm. The connection between arsenical wallpaper and the illness of those who lived in rooms decorated with it had been suspected since the 1840s, and had been argued with increasing evidence by physicians and chemists across the following decades. But it had remained contested, partly because the mechanism of harm was not immediately obvious, and partly because the manufacturers and distributors of arsenical wallpaper had a commercial interest in disputing the connection and the resources to maintain that dispute for a considerable period. The mechanism that eventually provided the most coherent explanation for wallpapers-related arsenic poisoning was proposed in a form that attracted serious scientific attention in the late 1880s, and it involved the action of certain molds, particularly the mold now known as Scopulariopsis brevicalis, that grew on the paste used to hang wallpaper in the damp conditions of Victorian homes, and that, in the process of metabolizing the arsenic compounds in the wallpaper pigments, produced a volatile arsenic compound known as trimethylarsine, a gas with a faint but characteristic garlic-like odor that could accumulate in poorly ventilated rooms and be inhaled by the inhabitants over extended periods. The Italian chemist Bartolomeo Gossio first described this mechanism in 1892, and while the full details of the chemistry he proposed required subsequent refinement, it was Frederick Challenger who, in the 20th century, fully characterized the methylation pathway involved. His basic insight was correct and provided, at last, a clear and scientifically grounded account of how wallpaper could make rooms dangerous without any direct contact between the wallpaper and the people who lived among it. The question of Napoleon Bonaparte's possible death from wallpaper arsenic, which has attracted considerable popular and scholarly attention since the 1960s, when tests on samples of Napoleon's hair revealed elevated arsenic levels, sits within this broader context of wallpaper-related arsenic exposure, though historians and toxicologists who have examined the evidence carefully have generally concluded that the question remains genuinely open, that the elevated arsenic in Napoleon's hair is real and consistent with chronic exposure, but that whether this exposure was sufficient to contribute to his death at St. Helena in 1821 is a matter that the available evidence does not permit to resolve with confidence. The green wallpaper that decorated certain rooms at Longwood House, Napoleon's residence at St. Helena, has been identified as arsenical, and samples of it preserved in archives have confirmed the presence of arsenic compounds in its pigments, lending the theory a degree of physical corroboration that is intriguing even if it is not conclusive. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the campaign against arsenical wallpaper gathered momentum through the 1870s and 1880s, driven in large part by the tireless advocacy of William Morris, who was, with characteristic irony, among the most celebrated designers of arsenical wallpapers of the Victorian era. His trellis pattern of 1862 and numerous subsequent designs having been produced using Scheele's green and related compounds. But who eventually, as the evidence of harm accumulated, became an advocate for the arsenic-free pigments that were beginning to become commercially available. Morris's personal journey on the arsenic question, from unwitting contributor to the problem to reluctant advocate for its solution, mirrors in miniature the broader trajectory of Victorian society's relationship with arsenic, a trajectory characterized by a long period of unawareness or denial, followed by a gradual, uncomfortable reckoning with the implications of a choice that had seemed, at the time it was made, entirely reasonable. The medical literature of the 1880s accumulated cases of what physicians were beginning to call arsenical poisoning from domestic sources. Families made ill by the wallpaper in their bedrooms and dining rooms. Children whose chronic ill health improved dramatically when they were removed from arsenical environments. Adults whose mysterious symptoms resolved when the wallpaper was stripped and replaced with non-arsenical alternatives. And these cases were reported in the Lancet and the British Medical Journal with a frequency and a consistency that made the pattern increasingly difficult to dismiss. By the early 1890s, several of the major wallpaper manufacturers had begun voluntarily producing arsenic-free lines alongside their conventional products, and the designation arsenic-free had become, in the language of the wallpaper trade, a genuine selling point evidence that consumer awareness had reached a level at which it was shaping commercial decisions in ways that preceded and perhaps helped create the conditions for more formal regulatory action. The relationship between arsenic and the practice of medicine in the Victorian era was, as we have already observed in earlier chapters, a complex and often contradictory one, in which the same substance that was poisoning wallpaper hung rooms and appearing in the stomach contents of murdered husbands was also being prescribed in carefully calibrated doses by physicians of genuine competence and sincere therapeutic intent for conditions ranging from skin diseases to anemia to certain forms of cancer. It is worth dwelling in this chapter on the medical uses of arsenic and on the ways in which they were understood and defended by the physicians who employed them, because those uses represent a thread of continuity in the history of arsenic that stretches from the ancient world to the early 20th century, and because they illuminate the degree to which the toxicity and the therapeutic potential of a substance are not simply opposed qualities, but rather aspects of a single pharmacological reality whose practical implications depend entirely upon dose and context. Fowler's solution remained the most widely prescribed arsenical preparation throughout the Victorian period, a fixture of the British pharmacopoeia and a routine component of medical practice, prescribed for its stimulant and alterative properties in cases where the physician wished to produce what was understood as a general improvement in the patient's constitutional condition, a concept whose vagueness reflected the genuine uncertainty about disease mechanisms that persisted in Victorian medicine, even as specific pathogen-based explanations for particular diseases were beginning to emerge in the 1860s and 1870s. The dermatological uses of arsenic were among the most firmly established in clinical practice, with both arsenical pastes applied topically and arsenical solutions taken internally having demonstrated measurable effects in the treatment of psoriasis, eczema, and certain other skin conditions, effects that had been documented in the medical literature with sufficient consistency that even physicians who were cautious about the broader therapeutic claims made for arsenic were willing to acknowledge its efficacy in these specific contexts. The use of arsenic in the treatment of certain blood disorders was also established, though imperfectly understood. Physicians had observed, empirically, that arsenic compounds produced changes in the blood picture of patients who took them, and while the significance of these changes was interpreted through theoretical frameworks that we would now regard as incorrect, the observations themselves were real, and they pointed, across the long arc of medical history, toward the eventually confirmed role of arsenic trioxide in the treatment of acute promyelocytic leukemia that would be demonstrated in the 20th century. Thomas Addison, the great Victorian physician, whose name is attached to the adrenal condition he described, and whose clinical observations were among the most precise and most carefully recorded of his era, used arsenic compounds in his practice at Guy's Hospital in London and documented their effects with the thoroughness that characterized all his clinical work, contributing to a body of evidence that both supported and complicated the simple narrative of arsenic as purely a poison. The great systematic pharmacologist, Jonathan Pereira, whose Materia Medica of 1839 to 1840 became the standard reference work for British pharmacy and therapeutics through the middle decades of the century, included arsenic compounds in his comprehensive survey, with careful attention to both their therapeutic applications and their toxic properties. noting the narrow therapeutic index, the small margin between beneficial and harmful doses, with a precision that reflected the empirical sophistication of the best Victorian medical practice. Arsenic was used in the treatment of malaria, where the antipyretic effects of arsenical compounds had been observed and recorded with sufficient frequency to establish an empirical basis for the practice. And in the treatment of certain nervous system conditions, where its effects on peripheral nerve function, now understood as a form of controlled neurotoxicity, were interpreted by Victorian physicians as a form of nerve stimulation that could be beneficial in conditions characterized by excessive neural activity. The use of arsenic in cancer treatment, meanwhile, represented a thread of medical practice that extended back through the entire history of Western medicine. And that would eventually, through the work of 20th and 21st century oncologists, working with arsenic trioxide in the treatment of specific leukemias, receive a form of scientific vindication that its Victorian practitioners could not have imagined, but that reflects, in a long and indirect way, the genuine but imperfectly understood observations they were making at the bedside. It is a reflection upon the nature of medical knowledge itself, that the same substance could simultaneously be the cause of thousands of deaths, the subject of murder trials and legislative debates, a hazard embedded in the walls and the clothing and the food of Victorian daily life, and also a genuine and effective therapeutic agent for specific conditions. That these were not different arsenics, but the same arsenic, the same element in the same chemical forms, whose relationship to human health was determined entirely by dose, route, duration, and the individual biological circumstances of the person encountering it. The final decades of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th brought with them a set of scientific and medical developments that would cumulatively and over a period of time reduce arsenic from its position as a central and defining substance of the Victorian era to something closer to a managed and monitored element of the modern chemical landscape, present still in the environment and in certain industrial and medical contexts, but no longer the casual, unregulated, omnipresent feature of domestic life that it had been for so much of the preceding century. The most significant of these developments, in terms of the immediate reduction of deliberate arsenic poisoning, was the refinement and widespread adoption of forensic toxicology as a standard component of medico-legal investigation, a development that owed its foundations to the work of Marsh and Orfila and their successors, but that gathered institutional momentum across the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s as the procedures for post-mortem toxicological analysis became standardized, as the training of physicians in their interpretation became more systematic, and as the expectation that suspicious deaths would be investigated with chemical tools became embedded in the legal and medical culture of Britain, France, and other European nations. The role of the public analyst, a position created in Britain by the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, was part of this broader institutionalization of chemical expertise in the service of public protection, giving local authorities access to trained analytical chemists who could examine not only food and drink for adulteration, but also, in relevant cases, biological samples in suspected poisoning investigations, providing a distributed network of forensic chemical expertise that supplemented the work of the occasional great names like Orfila, with the more routine, but no less important work of the many. The German chemist Hugo Reinsch had published in 1842 a modification of the arsenic detection procedure that was easier to perform and more broadly applicable than the Marsh test in certain circumstances. And subsequent workers contributed further refinements that made the detection of arsenic in biological tissues more reliable, more sensitive, and more accessible to the ordinary analytical chemist working in a hospital or a public analyst's laboratory rather than in a specialized research setting. In the courtroom, the accumulation of successful prosecutions in which forensic toxicological evidence had proved decisive contributed to a gradual shift in the culture of both the legal profession and the medical profession, creating a shared understanding that arsenic poisoning was a detectable crime, that the body of a victim preserved its chemical record of what had happened to it, and that the deliberate use of arsenic as a means of homicide had risks of detection that had simply not existed in the first decades of the century. The social and demographic patterns of arsenic murder changed accordingly, shifting. Historians of crime have argued, on the basis of the available statistical evidence, away from the sustained campaigns of repeated dosing that had characterized the most notorious earlier cases toward the rarer and increasingly desperate acts of those who either did not know or did not believe that the forensic tools now available would reveal what they had done. Meanwhile, the broader public health dimensions of the arsenic problem were addressed, piece by piece, through a combination of legislative action, voluntary industry change, and the gradual substitution of safer alternatives in the consumer products that had been the source of so much unintentional exposure. The use of arsenical pigments in wallpaper declined significantly through the 1880s and 1890s as non-arsenical alternatives became commercially available, and as consumer awareness made the arsenic-free designation increasingly valuable in the market, a transition that was completed in most major manufacturers' product lines by the early years of the 20th century, without requiring the specific legislative prohibition that some public health advocates had sought. The use of arsenic in agriculture, however, particularly in the form of Paris green and lead arsenate as insecticides for orchards and cotton fields, was expanding during exactly this period, creating a new and different dimension of arsenic exposure that affected farmers, agricultural workers, and consumers of treated produce in ways that would require an entirely separate set of regulatory responses across the 20th century, responses that lie beyond the scope of this particular history, but that remind us that the story of arsenoc's relationship with human society did not end with the Victorian era, that it simply transformed itself into new forms appropriate to the new century. The cultural legacy of arsenic in the Victorian era is encoded in the literature and the art and the popular imagination of the period in ways that persist faintly but recognizably in the culture of our own time, transmitted through the mystery fiction that the Victorian fascination with poison helped to create, and through the historical memory of the great poisoning cases that has been kept alive by each successive generation of writers and historians who have found in those cases a set of questions about gender, marriage, medicine, and the law that remain, in their essentials, as resonant today as they were in the courtrooms of Toole and Durham. The Victorian detective story, which emerged as a distinct literary form in the 1840s and flourished through the later decades of the century, was shaped in part by the cultural prominence of poison as a means of crime, and arsenic in particular as the poison of choice for the domestic murderer, and its conventions: the isolated household, the suspicious illness, the arrival of the investigator. the unraveling of a deception that had hidden itself behind the ordinary appearances of domestic life, reflect the actual texture of the arsenic poisoning cases that filled the newspapers and the courtrooms throughout the era. Edgar Allan Poe, whose influence on the detective story was foundational, was writing in an American cultural context, but one thoroughly penetrated by European developments in forensic science, and his creation of the analytical detective in the figure of Auguste Dupin in the early 1840s coincides almost exactly with the moment at which the Lafarge trial and the Marsh test were transforming public understanding of what forensic investigation could achieve. Wilkie Collins, whose sensation novels of the 1860s drew heavily on the newspaper reports of real criminal cases that he read with close and professional attention, incorporated poison and its detection into narratives of domestic deception and concealed identity that spoke directly to the anxieties of a reading public that had been formed, in part, by the great poisoning trials of the preceding decades. Arthur Conan Doyle, who was himself a physician, and who brought to the creation of Sherlock Holmes a detailed knowledge of the scientific methods of detection that were being developed and refined during his medical training in the 1870s and 1880s, created in Holmes a figure who embodied the application of chemical and medical expertise to the investigation of crime, a fantasy of the scientific detective that was made imaginatively plausible by the real achievements of the forensic chemists and toxicologists who had been transforming criminal investigation across the preceding half-century. The sensation novels and the detective stories of the Victorian era thus served a cultural function beyond their entertainment value, helping to disseminate among a broad reading public the understanding that the body preserved evidence, that chemistry could read that evidence, and that the domestic spaces of ordinary life, the kitchen, the bedroom, the dining room, were also, potentially, scenes of detection in which the trained eye and the analytical mind could uncover what had been carefully concealed. Arsenic, in the popular culture of the Victorian era, became a kind of shorthand for a particular kind of domestic treachery, the betrayal of the most intimate bonds of trust. And the literature of the period returned again and again to the image of the poisoner. At the hearth, patient, methodical, outwardly tender, as a figure that encapsulated a specific form of fear appropriate to the age, a fear about the hidden life of the household and the vulnerability of those who trust without reservation. The popular ballads and broadsides that followed each major poisoning trial, the songs about Mary Ann Cotton, the pamphlets about Madeline Smith, the newspaper verses about Catherine Wilson, represented a folk tradition of moral commentary on these cases that ran parallel to the more formal literary responses and that reached audiences for whom novels and medical journals were not accessible, carrying the stories of the poisoners into the oral culture of the working class in forms that were both morally instructive and, inevitably, somewhat sensationalized. The image of arsenic as the inheritor's powder, as the domestic weapon, as the particular resort of those who lacked the physical strength or the social freedom to resolve their situations by more direct means, was a cultural construction that told a specific story about Victorian society's anxieties regarding the position of women, the constraints of marriage, and the forms of agency available to those who found themselves trapped in circumstances from which the law offered no relief. A story that historians of gender and crime have been unpacking with considerable subtlety across the past several decades, finding in the arsenic poisoning cases of the Victorian era a complex and troubling mirror of the social conditions that shaped them. The early decades of the 20th century brought the Victorian era's relationship with arsenic to its gradual and quiet conclusion, not through any single transformative event, but through the accumulation of changes in forensic science, in pharmaceutical regulation, in the chemistry of industrial production, in the social conditions that had made certain forms of arsenic use both possible and, in some cases, attractive, that together constituted the slow recession of arsenic from the central place it had occupied in the material and the imaginative life of the preceding century. The therapeutic use of arsenic reached a kind of culmination in the early 20th century through the work of Paul Ehrlich, the German physician and immunologist, who received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1908, and who developed in his Frankfurt laboratory the first modern chemotherapeutic agent in the form of a compound known as salvarsan or arsphenamine, an organoarsenic compound that proved effective against syphilis, and that represented, in its systematic development through hundreds of compounds tested in a deliberate and methodical screening program, a new model for pharmaceutical discovery that would shape the entire subsequent history of drug development. Salvarsan was introduced in 1909 and was hailed as a genuine miracle of modern medicine, the first truly specific chemical treatment for a specific infectious disease, and its development drew upon the long tradition of arsenical therapeutics, while transforming it into something recognizably modern, something based on systematic chemical synthesis and controlled biological testing, rather than on the empirical traditions that had governed the use of Fowler's solution and its predecessors. The success of salvarsan brought arsenic back, temporarily, to a position of therapeutic respectability, this time within the framework of the emerging science of chemotherapy, rather than the older tradition of empirical pharmacy, and it demonstrated that the pharmacological properties of arsenic compounds, properly understood and properly applied, were genuinely capable of producing specific and beneficial effects that extended far beyond the vague constitutional improvements claimed by earlier practitioners. Meanwhile, the regulatory framework around arsenic was continuing to develop, with successive pieces of legislation in Britain and other countries addressing the various dimensions of arsenic's presence in the environment. In food, in pesticides, in industrial emissions, in ways that progressively reduced the routine exposure of the general population, though the pace of this reduction was uneven across different countries and different exposure routes. And the problem of arsenic in drinking water, particularly in regions where naturally occurring arsenic contamination of groundwater is significant, remains a genuine public health concern in parts of the world that lies, as we have noted, beyond the chronological scope of this particular story. The forensic dimension of arsenic's legacy in the Victorian era found its most sophisticated expression in the 20th century through the development of increasingly sensitive analytical techniques, atomic absorption spectroscopy, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, that made the detection of arsenic in biological tissues and in environmental samples possible at concentrations far below those detectable by even the most refined versions of the Marsh test, techniques that have been applied retrospectively to historical cases, including those of Napoleon and various other historical figures, whose deaths have attracted suspicion, with results that are scientifically interesting, even when they are not historically conclusive. The question of what the Victorian era's relationship with arsenic ultimately tells us about the nature of progress, about how societies come to Recognize hazards that have been present all along, about the political and commercial forces that slow the translation of scientific knowledge into protective action, about the ways in which the most ordinary and unremarkable features of daily life can turn out to be the most significant in their long-term consequences, is one that historians of science and technology have found endlessly productive, generating a literature of remarkable richness that touches on questions of class, gender, expertise, and governance that extend far beyond the specific chemistry of element 33. The story of arsenic in the Victorian era is, in one reading, a story about ignorance and its consequences, about a world that did not know what it was living with, and paid a price for that ignorance in illness, and in death, and in the particular form of domestic tragedy that the poisoning trial represents. In another reading, it is a story about knowledge and its limits, about scientists and physicians and legislators working at the edges of what was understood, making reasonable decisions with the information available to them, building piece by piece a framework of comprehension and regulation that was always incomplete and always somewhat behind the problem, but that was nonetheless real progress, genuine movement toward a world in which the material conditions of daily life were better understood and more adequately managed than they had been before. The Victorian era did not resolve the arsenic problem. It bequeathed it, in transformed and reduced but not eliminated form, to the 20th century, and the 20th century bequeathed it, in yet further transformed form, to our own. But it did something of lasting importance. It developed the scientific tools, the legal frameworks, the institutional structures, and the cultural awareness that made resolution possible, that turned arsenic from an invisible and unnamed presence in the body and the home into a substance that could be detected, regulated, prosecuted, and ultimately, if never entirely, contained. The last chapter of the arsenic story, in its Victorian telling, is not a chapter of triumph or of catastrophe, but of something quieter and more ambiguous, the slow fading of a substance from the center of public consciousness, as it becomes, over the course of decades, a managed and monitored, rather than a casual and unremarked presence in the world. The great poisoning trials that had defined the middle decades of the 19th century became, by the 1890s and the early 1900s, less frequent, their decline reflecting both the improved forensic capacity to detect arsenic poisoning and the legislative restrictions on arsenic's availability that made it a less convenient instrument than it had been when it could be purchased without record at any corner shop in England. The arsenical wallpapers that had once been the pride of Victorian drawing rooms were stripped and replaced in fashionable households with papers of newer and safer designs, and the brilliant arsenical greens that had glowed by gaslight in 1,000 parlours faded from the walls of Victorian England into the history of industrial design, preserved now only in museum samples and in the archives of those historians of material culture who have made it their work to understand what those walls were actually made of and what they actually did to the people who lived among them, the flour makers and the fabric workers and the smelter employees whose occupational exposure to arsenic had made them, in the clinical literature of the mid-Victorian period, figures of particular medical concern, were gradually protected by improving workplace standards, though the pace of improvement was, as in all such histories, slower than the evidence of harm warranted, and faster than the commercial interests involved would have chosen of their own accord. Fowler's solution, that long-lived survivor of the arsenical therapeutic tradition, continued to appear in the British pharmacopoeia well into the 20th century, prescribed for conditions that ranged from psoriasis to chronic myeloid leukemia in doses that were monitored with considerably more care than they had been in the earlier decades of its use, before finally being withdrawn from official therapeutic use in Britain in the 1950s. Though the observation that arsenic trioxide retained genuine efficacy against certain forms of leukemia would be confirmed by Chinese clinical researchers working in the 1970s and 1990s, and would lead, at the turn of the 21st century, to the regulatory approval of arsenic trioxide as a treatment for acute promyelocytic leukemia in the United States and Europe, completing, in a sense, the long arc of arsenic's relationship with medicine by returning it, at last, to a context in which its pharmacological properties could be fully understood and safely employed. The philosophers of chemistry and medicine who have reflected on what the history of arsenic teaches us have generally concluded that it is, above all, a lesson in the complexity of the relationship between human beings and the material world they inhabit, a lesson about the way in which substances resist the simple categories of good and bad, safe and dangerous, medicine and poison, and insist instead on being understood in their full complexity, in all the multiplicity of their effects and their contexts and their doses. The Victorian era, with all its remarkable energy and all its considerable blind spots, gave us the forensic tools to see arsenic clearly, the legislative will to address it partially, and the cultural memory, encoded in literature and in law, and in the long tradition of historical scholarship that continues to this day, to remember what it cost not to see it at all. And so the story of arsenic settles, as all long stories eventually do, into the quieter register of history, the register of things understood, of lessons partially absorbed, of a world that was changed, slowly and imperfectly, and always somewhat too late, by the accumulated weight of evidence and compassion, and the human need to protect the living from what the past did not yet know how to see. The great chemists and the physicians and the legislators, and even the poisoners themselves, recede into their times, their names preserved in the case reports, and the court records, and the pages of the journals that documented, with whatever imperfect tools were available, the strange and significant story of a white powder and a civilization that lived, for a century and more, in its quiet and consequential company. Meanwhile, here you are, in the dark, in the warmth of the present, breathing slowly, your body at rest, the weight of history settling around you, like a gentle thing, the long Victorian century drifting away from you now, like smoke from a candle that has just been softly blown out, leaving only the darkness and the quiet and the steady, unhurried rhythm of your own breath, moving in and out, carrying you gently towards sleep, while the past does what the past always does. It waits, patient and still, for morning,